In the U.S., sex-selective abortion is a wedge issue cynically used by anti-choice activists to limit the reproductive rights of women. But in other parts of the world, sex selection has led to an alarming problem, a woman shortage to the tune of about 80 million. This has created some devastating consequences for women, particularly in Asia, where the shortage is most profound. From Human Rights Watch, on the phone, we're joined by Liesl Gerntholtz, the executive director of their Women's Rights Division. Liesl, welcome to 112BK.
Thank you very much, MacKenzie.
Can you tell me a little bit about this problem, specifically in China and India?
Well, in China and India, you've had very specific government policies that have led to the so-called woman shortage. So in China, you have had a policy that sort of from the early 80s right up until 2015 was a one-child policy. And this was attempting to limit the size of families, but in effect, what it did do was lead to sex-selective abortions, female infanticide, and so on. So you had large numbers of families who really did everything in their power to make sure that their only child was a boy. And in India, you've also had a lot of, you've had also sex-selective abortions, but also a range of other measures that also privileged sons. So in two of the most populous countries in the world, you have very skewed sex ratios and very large numbers of men and much smaller numbers of girls.
And partially, as you mentioned, this can be attributed to abortion or infanticide, but in other cases, it might just be, for example, that maybe girls receive fewer trips to the doctor or in other ways die at a young age. Is that accurate?
Yes, there are a whole range of practices that really meant that girls had less access to health care. And when we're talking about girls, we're talking often about babies. So you have everything from sex-selective abortions to less access to health care, to less food, to less care, to a whole range of practices, both cultural and traditional, that privilege boys over girls and leading or helping create this skewed sex ratio.
And talk to me about some of those reasons why a family might want a boy rather than a girl.
Well, you have sort of, I mean, at the root of it really is gender discrimination, where boys were just seen as more important than girls. In some societies, when girls marry, they are expected to leave their family's home and live with the family of their husband, which means that boys in the family are traditionally then expected to take care of elderly parents. So there's sort of a financial incentive for families to have boys. Many of the societies where you see these skewed sex ratios have practices like dowry payments, so much more expensive for families to have girls because they have to pay bride wealth. So, you know, a whole range of practices that really have their roots in gender discrimination and the devaluing of girls.
I think often when we talk about this, the blame comes down to the pregnant women. We think of them as monsters for aborting girl babies. But actually what you're describing is a climate in which cultural practices devalue women and force parents into uncomfortable choices.
I think that's right. And I think in China in particular, you have these cultural practices that were then reinforced and supported by government laws and policies. So it's not only sort of society in general, but it is often sort of policies on the part of particular governments that continue to shape gender discrimination. So, and yes, I think sort of the sense that women are in control and are able to make these decisions is really not borne out when you see the kinds of pressure that are put on women to produce sons, when you have laws and policies that mean that, you know, in China you had a practice of forcible abortions for families who had more than one child. So, yeah, I mean, I think it is always very interesting that, in essence, the people with the least power in this equation are often the ones who are blamed for what happened.
And let's talk a little bit about the current situation in China, where there are 34 million more males approximately than women, and in India where there's 37 million. What has this led to? What are some of the unintended consequences of this gender bias?
So one of the things that we've documented in China has been the phenomenon of bride trafficking. And what we have seen there is women from Burma, and as you probably know, Burma has been in a state of civil war for a long time, so you have people who are forced by conflict, by famine, to look for economic opportunities elsewhere, so it makes them very vulnerable to trafficking. And you see then women being kidnapped, being abducted, being taken to China, and then being forced into marriage. And in essence, what our report, which will come out in a couple of weeks, documents, is not so much the desire of men to be married, but the desire of their families for children. So we documented women who were abducted, kept imprisoned by families, being forced to become pregnant, and then many who were released or allowed to return home without their children once they'd given birth once or twice. So you're seeing families go to extreme and extremely abusive measures to be able to obtain wives for their sons, to obtain children, and so on. So it gives rise to things that are profoundly harmful and abusive to women.
With the end of China's one-child policy in 2015, do you think that this problem will subside?
No, because you already have a huge demographic problem. So you hope that the problem will slowly begin to subside, but you effectively already have a generation where there are many more men than there are women in China. So you already have a problem where large numbers of men will not be able to find partners, will not be able to get married, will not be able to have children if that's what they want. So, it's a little bit late to deal with that generation.
Many provinces in China, and also I believe Vietnam, now have laws on the books that outlaw sex-selective abortion. Are those type of laws the way forward?
I don't think so. I think that outlawing sex-selective abortions has simply been another burden on women. So I think what I would advocate for would be, firstly, women being able to access a full range of sexual and reproductive health care, which includes information about contraception, access to contraception, access to antenatal care, a whole range of sort of services that allow women to make real choices about their bodies and about continuing or ending pregnancies. And of course, what you really want is to have these services available in a society and a community that values equality between men and women, that respects women's rights to control their own bodies, that values the lives of girls in the same way as it does boys. You want to really sort of undermine a demand for boys rather than girls and take away the pressure that women feel in having to produce a son rather than a daughter.
Liesl Gerntholtz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.